Welcome to the XY Advisor podcast. To join a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice, head to xyadvisor.com.
So I was thinking about it the other day, and I know there's a little bit of emotion that gets driven by financial advisors when you think of that advertisement on TV with the little escalators and from little things, big things grow, and we don't pay commission to financial advisors. And clearly XY Advisor is focused on advice. And look, I'm not necessarily an advocate of people clipping the ticket along the way without doing the work. But I know that ad in particular has definitely struck a chord with the industry. But as I was thinking a little bit deeper about this, I was like, okay, well, industry funds, yeah, all well and good. They're for members and all that sort of stuff. They're affiliated more often than not with an industry, which is fine. But actually, there's a lot of people in those funds that need financial advice. And those industry funds have financial advisors. So it was always just sort of an interesting thing that they were talking. It was almost anti-advisor sentiment. Not that it was anti-advisor, but certainly the feeling, and I'm sure advisors listening to this would resonate or perhaps agree with that. But actually, I think about it, and on the other side of the trenches, these advisors are there, and to that end, I've invited Joel Harty, who are currently working together. Joel spent a number of years in the industry fund land, so I thought, who better than Joel to talk through his experiences? So with that, Joel, thanks for coming, mate.
Thank you, mate. Thanks for having me.
First things first, we're recording this down at XY Advisor in Circular Quay, and you were working across the way, and you were talking about the guys in the building and in the lobby. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to work across the road here in the Gateway building at Circular Quay, for anyone who's familiar with it. And one of the things I noticed the first time I ever walked in there was the amount of guys walking around in very sharp blue suits with a white shirt, and all of them seemed to be 6'5" tall. So I said to myself at the time, what do all these people do, right? And it turns out a lot of them worked in investment banks, and certainly a world I had never been exposed to or familiar with. And yeah, as Ray sort of alluded to, spending a lot of time in the profit for member space, and also what you would call industry fund land as well.
But I'm interested in, because there were a few celebrities in the lobby, right, that you would sort of grab a coffee with in the morning?
Yeah, well, not necessarily grab a coffee with. I think I would
grab a coffee next to?
Yeah, I think I would like to in my own mind. But Malcolm Turnbull was one, Paul Keating was another, David Murray. A lot of people wearing the little gong on the lapel, so one could only read into that. But
so what was that like? Because I sort of think of, like, you know, if you travel first class, you're in a lounge and everyone speaks in hushed tones because it's all very private and confidential information. So if you're in a lobby with these fellas and ladies, what's it like? Did you ever overhear anything? Not that I need you to share what it was, but it's kind of an interesting dynamic, right?
It is an interesting dynamic. It's certainly a world away from where a lot of what a lot of people are familiar with. I think. And you know, the part of town, obviously, that I was working in at the time, I think that the sort of companies that were represented in this, I would call it an ivory tower in a way, but But you know, once you sort of got used to it, you got used to it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. How much were the coffees?
Same price as they are uptown,
there
mate.
You go.
$4.50, $4.50. Yeah, wow. I had a really good cafe out in the way that friendly staff there. So
I do see Johnny Howard and his eyebrows walking around town quite a bit. It's kind of cool.
Yep.
So tell me, mate. Like, obviously, I did a little bit of an intro there, but working in an industry fund, like for me, I've worked in A&P and then I've worked in private advice land basically for the rest of my professional life. And industry funds have always been I don't know if it's like a psychological war, but it's like, I'm not one of them and they're not one of me, and you either subscribe to that side or the other. But mate, what's it like? Is that a thing? What's it like on the other side of the trenches?
I think it is a thing in a way, Ray. And what I will say is that as advisors, we're all in the one pool together. We all sit the FASER exam. We all are a member of the FPA, or we might be a member of the AFA.
Yeah.
A lot of us came up through the same sort of channels and found our way into this industry. But when you're actually working in a certain organisation, you do start to embed the culture of that organisation. I think with industry funds, you start to embed a method of thinking in a lot of ways. And I noticed it now that I've worked for Pivot and with you in a much smaller business, one that deals with clients who are of a younger demographic, work in the tech sector largely. It's a very, 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 very different environment to what I was in previously. But the thing I noticed most was that, ultimately these organisations have huge membership bases. And a lot of these members have never seen a financial advisor. And certainly one of the things that the fund I previously worked for and also the company before that was that trying to touch all of these people was very difficult from an advice perspective. But there was a real desire to educate, first and foremost, clients on what their options were, particularly around retirement and post-retirement. Educate them on as to the investments that they were invested in and where their money was going and really tried to provide a better outcome financially for these people over time.
Yeah, fair. And I imagine, industry super, uni super has defined benefits, so it speaks to a lot of retirement stuff. But you being an advisor in an industry fund, is it almost like people looking at you going, "Oh, you're one of them," or is it just, you know what I'm saying? Because on the ads, basically, if you read. The underlying message of the ads is that you shouldn't pay advisors commission, but actually how it comes across is don't trust advisors because you don't know how they get paid. Yeah. So you being an advisor in there, is it, what's it like?
Look, it's the purpose of, and in terms of Uni Super, I can't speak specifically for the brand and what, the reasons why they set up the business. And previous to that, I worked for State Plus, which is a fairly well-known organisation as well.
What's State Plus? Is that
that used to be called State Super Financial Services, okay. What it was once called.
Okay.
Looking after the state government public service employees, and Uni Super, obviously, in the university sector. Yeah. But really, the design of the model was to educate the membership and ensure that the financial outcomes they were receiving were good ones. And I think a lot of the reason why the advice function was set up in these businesses was because third-party advice firms had largely not understood the defined benefit nature of the fund or what the funds were in that time, but also, would really push products onto these people that didn't necessarily meet their best interests once upon a time. Now, I'm talking several years ago now, but the catalyst for setting up decent sized advice businesses in a lot of these funds was to ensure that the members were looked after properly and protected. And it was not out of a philanthropic sort of mindset, but it's certainly out of a looking after the people who are contributing to the fund. That makes
a lot of sense, because I know, defined benefits scare the hell out of me as an advisor. My default is don't touch it. Like, it just makes me so nervous. But I equally, on the other side of the things, and Faizy, I think, talk about the compliance aspect of things. Not compliance, but the competency. I shouldn't be advising on a defined benefit. I don't understand it. But, and being an industry fund, then having a bunch of advisors who aren't fully educated around the nuances of a defined benefit, providing advice and ultimately maybe creating horrible, irreversible outcomes. Clearly, you'd want to find a solution for that.
That was one of the catalysts for initially setting up a lot of these in-house advice models. But I think over time, what it really started to develop into was a way of educating members, and we always talked about members rather than clients because they were members of the fund. Educating members into what their options were, trying to create better financial outcomes for those people. Many of whom, weren't necessarily really well off. They weren't working in salubrious occupations. It was almost the paradox of those people I was talking about earlier in the podcast in the foyer. the guys in the blue suits, 6 foot tall, talking about life down at the Sheaf in Double Bay on the weekend. These people were your typical mum and dad sort of, clients and members of the fund who financial literacy was not something that they would be across in their everyday lives necessarily, and they really relied on an advisor to guide them through the headwinds or the process of particularly pre and post retirement.
Were they mostly teachers? Is that what UniSuper is?
Well, UniSuper, they looked after people in the higher ed sector, so your universities and your related bodies. State Plus looked after mainly public servants in, whether it be police, nurses, teachers, white collar public servants. So it was a slightly different mix, but there was a lot of similarities as well.
Mm.
Yeah,
it's interesting. So I suppose the next question would be, and if nothing else, we were able to answer this question for everyone listening: how does a defined benefit work?
Yeah, right. Okay. Good. Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because defined benefits are a bit of a taboo topic, I find, and coming to Pivot and sort of sitting on the other side of the fence. Even now, I sort of have to rack my brain as to what some of the nuances of these things were. But really what it is, it's a formula-driven outcome for a person at a certain age. You think about accumulation funds when we're talking about super, and it's defined contribution, and then the opposite to that is a defined benefit. So the person receives a set benefit based on a bunch of parameters at a certain age. Largely things like salary play into it, the rate of contribution, whether you're full-time, part-time, years of service is a big one. Mm-hmm. And I would say that a lot of particularly the public sector, but also even in the higher ed sector, it was almost a bit of a quasi-retention policy. If these people had a defined benefit, they were almost in their job to get that better retirement outcome, and would probably put up with more than what you and I would
in the private sector.
Yeah, in the private sector in order to achieve that. But they provided a hell of a lot of security. And I think when you're in your latter years of your working career, there's a level of security that is really important. And if you had an outcome that was guaranteed versus one that was unknown,
why would you ever take the risk?
Why would you ever take the risk? Yeah.
And so the formula, as I understand it, is you talk salary times years of service times
accrual benefit. Like there's an accrued benefit ratio. It's almost like, well, how much does the person contribute? What's their salary? It's a multiple of that. Right. What's their years of service? There's another multiple of that. And
years of service being for a specific business or working in an industry, or what?
Look, in the public sector, you could have been a nurse and then transitioned to being a CEO of Treasury. That's a tenure. So it's the same tenure
because it's government.
Yeah, because it's all government. Yeah,
right, okay.
So that all counts, but. Yeah, it's really what it's looking at is a tenure within the same organisation in inverted commas, but that could be the whole sector technically too.
Because that and this is in the detail now, but I'm interested in. So if I've got an AMBO who's saying, "Ray, I want to become a cop," what does that mean for my retirement?
Well, really, the only impact would be on salary. So if that person's salary changed substantially, that would impact the defined benefit. The contribution rate would be commensurate to what the salary was. So the years of service would continue.
Okay. Because of government.
Yep. But those other two conditions that I mentioned would change.
So does that then mean, because I was thinking about this as well, I understand the contribution rate or that metric, but later in life, if you've got somebody who wants to go part-time, let's say you're on $100,000 a year and you want to go down to less days, and you decide to take a job in the same organization, meet all the other things, $60,000 a year, you're in that for the last couple of years of your professional life. Does that then create a problem for your retirement?
Typically it doesn't. And really you've got to remember that these schemes were designed ultimately through a bargaining process with the employer and the union movement. So there was always this skewing toward, well, what's going to be in the best interests of the member? And we talk a lot about best interests now in advice land, but they were talking about that back in the 80s and the early 90s in terms of designing some of these schemes. How does that protect the people who work for us? And how does that protect some of our members, whether you're looking at it from the union side? So that collective agreement is what you now see represented in some of these defined benefits. And one of the things that they try to do is prevent you being disadvantaged if you were to go part-time. And I think that's probably particularly important for a lot of women who would spend time out of the workforce, having kids and that sort of thing, and then going part-time as well. So it does affect the accrual rate, but it doesn't impact typically the full-time salary is used to work out the formula.
Right. And then I suppose it sounds like, and one of the interesting things here is that there's no commercial agenda, right? Because it's, as a financial advisor in a private business, obviously we do the right thing by people, but at the end of the day, there's a commercial outcome that needs to happen for the lights to turn on. Yeah. But in an industry fund, that's not the case, right? It's not the ambition. And as you say, in the 80s, they were starting to talk about a lot of this stuff because it was more of a social good, it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And it's amazing when I used to really advise a lot of pre-retiree clients particularly, it was amazing to see the difference that made over the sort of years in which they were leading up to retirement and the sort of balances that people had. You compare that to the average Australian and they were miles ahead. Part of it was because they had worked in this similar occupation and contributed at a similar rate and had fairly incremental salary rises over that time. But a lot of it as well was because, prior to 1993, I think it was, there was no compulsory super guarantee. But these people, a lot of them were already contributing to some sort of superannuation arrangement pre that time. So they had a real head start, and that's made a big difference when they hit, the likes of 60, 65.
Yeah. It's just an interesting world. And so what, I guess the other thing would be then, if you're an advisor who gets a defined benefit client, like do they, before I get into that, do they even exist? As in, if you're a younger teacher, let's say you just graduated uni, you become an academic in a university, you apply for your fund and you go through the institution one. Do you get a defined benefit? So
the answer is yes and no. These things, I think what's probably worth mentioning is that it's very, very rare in 2020 for anybody to have a defined benefit. That's the first thing. The only known open defined benefit scheme that you can join today is, in fact, to my knowledge, it's UniSuper. They do still have an open defined benefit scheme. It does pay a lump sum at the end of retirement if you were to join today, for example. But I think one of the reasons that a lot of them have since closed is because of the cost. And also
the fact, they're too generous to the member?
Well, not too generous necessarily, Ray, but the fund has to budget for this outcome that it really doesn't know what it's going to pay and how long people are going to live for. And that's really the unknown, especially when some of the earlier people were in full pension schemes. Things like Triple S, which is an old state government scheme.
The Reserve Bank, I think.
Reserve Bank has one. CSS is another one from the Commonwealth side of things. So how do these funds actually budget and project for that? Well, really what you need is an actuarial study of what the membership looks like and what are the benefits that we're going to have to pay out in the future. And you have to set that money aside and invest it now in order to cover those liabilities.
How do you do that though? Because, and I always say this, is the things that keep us alive tomorrow don't exist yet. So, I don't know what my life expectancy could be. It could be 150. I got no idea.
Yeah. A lot of these arrangements were designed when people lived a lot shorter lives.
Yeah.
We're now living to where, in our early 90s, late 80s. So the funding of it is a real challenge. And that's, I'd hazard a guess, but that's one of the reasons why you don't see many open defined benefits anymore, is because of that cost.
So graduating university, going into a university as an academic, if you participated in that fund, you're going into an accumulation fund?
Well, in the case of UniSuper, they do still have an open defined benefit fund.
Yeah.
Which, if you're a permanent employee, you can join.
Yeah.
They also have accumulation funds, of course, like any other industry fund does, but it's very rare, I would say, in the big scheme of things, to come across an open one.
When in a conversation that we had in preparation for this, we were talking about defined benefits, and we were talking about the fact that a defined benefit isn't necessarily an income stream for the rest of your life, but it is also a formula that creates a lump sum payment. And it sounded like it was a similar thing that an advisor would do, where you work out what the SG is relative to a conservative rate of return on a portfolio.
Sure.
So, and that it wasn't always favourable to be in the defined benefit?
Yeah, that's true. I think depending on the nuances of the, whatever scheme you're talking about, it may make more sense to be in something that is market linked.
Yeah.
Especially in an environment where you do have fairly buoyant share markets. Now, I'm not talking about immediately at the moment with COVID and what's happening globally, but certainly depending on your situation, there's a lot to say that perhaps it's not the best option.
Yeah, I guess thinking super compliantly, right? Like me as a financial advisor, someone's got a defined benefit which creates a formula to create a lump sum. I start to get nervous about the notion of, even if it is better off going somewhere else, I don't know that I would, and this could just be an ignorant thing, but I don't know that I would ever tell someone to roll out of it just out of fear. I'd probably tell them that I am ignorant and that I'm not the right person to ask, but I don't know. I feel nervous about the idea of telling someone to move out of that into an accumulation, because if anything were to happen, let's say we hit a recession and then we experience 20 years of low returns, and then the client turns around and goes, "Well, hang on, the formula says I'm going to have 500 grand more."
Yeah.
Is that a reality?
That's a reality. Yeah, and I think the trepidation of a lot of advisors is around, well, I'm so conscious of not providing advice that's not in the best interest of clients. Therefore, I'll either choose to ignore that side of things or heed caution and just
go to
advocate.
Old Harty, the advisor in the fund.
Correct. Yeah. That's a solution. And those guys, those advisors working in these funds are good advisors. They are well skilled. A lot of them have their, qualifications and CFP and all that sort of stuff. And I worked with a lot of great people, and they're just as good as any advisor outside.
Would they? Let's say you're still at an industry fund, and I'm a private financial advisor, and I've got this guy coming in or lady coming in, and they've got an industry fund with a defined benefit, and I don't know what it is. I don't know how it works. Would it be possible, or is it your sense that most advisors would be open to this? That me as a financial advisor, I'll agree to provide advice on everything excluding the defined benefit, but that we agree to client plus Ray going into the industry fund and approach an industry fund advisor, and we get scoped advice specific to that.
Yeah, you certainly could. That would be a way to mitigate some risk for you as an advisor,
but also to get the best outcome, because I don't have an idea.
Yeah, to get the best outcome for the client, and certainly, as we've just spoken about for the last 5-10 minutes, there's a lot of nuances in these arrangements that can make or break a client outcome. And so, if you're talking to somebody who really knows the back to front of these arrangements, then at least you could be comfortable that the client is being looked after in every sense of the word. Yeah. And then you're comfortable as well that you're providing the best advice you can.
But practically, I suppose, is it your sense that advisors in industry funds would be open to receiving a call from a private advisor?
I think the vast majority would, and if it was me still sitting in the chair, I would. But I certainly think that we're all one cohort when it comes to being an advisor. I really don't think. I think that there has been this rivalry between retail land and industry fund land, definitely. And I think you've seen that amplified with the likes of the issues that's happening over at places like AMP. Some of the bank scandals that were sort of.
It plays to the narrative, doesn't it, of dividing the.
Yeah, it does, and these big industry funds were already popular alternatives to the retail environment post, or even pre, I should say, the Banking Royal Commission and all of that. But they have. There's no doubt they would have massively benefited from some of the issues happening in retail fund land. But that's not to say that there shouldn't be healthy competition and that there shouldn't be an environment where clients get to choose who they invest their superannuation with. But from my experience, these funds do the absolute best job they can at ensuring that members are looked after.
Yeah. I get a sense there's less of a commercial agenda as an advisor there. So
really the aim, and look, I'm speaking here, in terms of not referring to any one fund particularly, but really the aim is to retain members into retirement. So the demographic of industry funds is vastly accumulation focused.
Yeah.
And once they hit that 60 point, a lot of people are then looking for options as to what they do. And the advice that's provided is really in that space. It's okay, well, what do we do now with your funds that you're going to move into retirement? How do we provide an income stream in retirement?
Sure.
What does that look like? Can we model a scenario where it ensures that you're comfortable? And traditionally, these places have really struggled to retain the post-retirement client, and they've lost them to independent financial advisors, third parties, to the retail space, self-managed super up until recently as well, I would say. Yeah. So the having an in-house advice model, in a way, is designed to retain those people into the retirement space and then provide advice on an ongoing basis, potentially.
I suppose one of the lovely things as well in the private advice space is that with FASIA and the Royal Commission, there's certainly a drop in advisors who are charging through product.
Sure.
So that the issue that may have existed in the early 2000s when you've got a client walking in who has an industry fund, that doesn't necessarily become an issue anymore because it's not a driver of how you get paid. So I wonder if the opportunity or the future between industry funds and advisors or the private advice space is blue. I
think it is blue, Ray, and I think that if you see the relationship you see the path Sun Super has gone down.
Yeah.
As an example, I mean they have really made an effort to engage with independent financial advisors and create a model where partnering them is very easy and fairly seamless, and they have people there who are willing to reach out and help at every step of the advice process. But I think across the board, a lot of industry funds are very conscious that they have enormous membership bases that cannot be serviced by an in-house advice team. And in fact, to employ a wholly in-house advice team costs a lot of money.
Would do.
It requires a substantial subsidy from the fund because, we know, you and me know what it costs to run an advice business. It's very substantial.
Yeah.
So there has to be some sort of cross-subsidisation there, a way to avoid or prevent a situation where, A, you can't service everybody, but B, the costs blow out to an enormous level by having all these people in-house that you're directly employing, is to get on board with trusted, and I'll say that word, third-party advice providers. Yeah.
Yeah, I get a sense the climate is right for that to get better or enhanced, I suppose.
And I reckon as well, I've sort of seen the other side of the coin now since being with Pivot, but there was a bit of a mentality, and I must say that there has always traditionally been a bit of a mentality of us versus them. And I don't think that comes from advisors specifically, but I think it comes from this idea of industry versus retail.
Yeah.
And that's a legacy thing. That's not something that any one particular organisation has dreamed up. I think it's a bit of a legacy thing. But the adverts with, I think it's John Wood, he's the one standing on the escalator with the hands.
That's just the image everyone thinks of.
That's
right?
the image everyone thinks of, and the escalator's going up, and one guy's doing really, really well, and the other guy's doing not so well, and it's like, well, what's really the difference here? Because, and I've seen this recently, that there's a lot of retail funds now that are charging lower fees than most industry funds. You think about some of the fees that you see on a regular basis, and I won't name any funds, but there are some out there that are fairly expensive.
Yeah.
And then you compare that to a retail option, and it's hugely competitive.
Yeah.
Now
it doesn't seem to be, because I mean, in the early days, it would be this isn't a definitive rule, but industry funds would be a little bit cheaper. The retail fund would be a bit more expensive because the advisor would get paid along the way. But the idea was that would subsidise the advisor and create a relationship. But I think those days are numbered. I think now equally you talk about some supers. So I don't know. We actually had Brian Parker, I believe his name is, the chief investment officer. He was in XY Advisor podcast earlier, but I wonder if they're starting to. I don't know if they're listening to advisors and starting to create options that satisfy that, and Australian Super is a really good example as well of another fund that's talking to advisors and creating frameworks that allow that to happen, or if clients are starting to demand things because with cheap cost index investing because advisors are starting to play more in that space. I don't know if there's chicken or the egg there.
I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think it's both. I think clients are more educated and perhaps savvy than they have traditionally been.
At a time where the defined benefit thing isn't a guaranteed income stream for the rest of your life, so it's becoming less favourable.
Yeah,
people are looking at this stuff more.
Exactly, and really, there's very few people left in a lot of these arrangements too. So call it 98% of. I can't say the exact number because I'm not too sure, but let's say 98% of people are in an accumulation fund, and you've got full choice. And you're looking for an arrangement that is not only cost effective but provides a great return and has all the features that you're after. I think that there's a huge amount of competition out there, and clients are becoming more savvy, which is great because what that does is eventually it reduces costs for everybody. The biggest cost, as you're probably aware, with any organisation is your staffing, and then in terms of a large business that manages a lot of money, fund manager fees, and where a lot of bigger funds have reduced costs is by bringing that in-house to some degree.
The fund management.
Yeah. Or using index funds that are run by a large, international.
Yeah, Vanguard or a BlackRock or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I don't know if you're across this because it's a bit of an interesting one, but I know there are a couple of industry funds that have been dragged through the coals. I think specifically of one who were dragged through the coals in the GFC after the global financial crisis. They were the top performing fund, or they were one of them. But a couple of years later, they went from the top quartile to the bottom one. And the reason was that this particular fund held a large portion of unlisted assets.
Sure. Yep.
So, as I understand, unlisted assets get valued at a different rate to listed assets, which is live. So they were reporting figures based on a performance that was driven from valuations on old valuations. Then the asset got revalued, and overnight it went boom, boom, boom. So I guess my question is, what I'm intrigued with is how unlisted assets work, because clearly there's merits to it, and I don't know if you're across this, but it just strikes me as an interesting asset class that I don't understand.
I think there's a few. If you're talking about industry funds, there's probably a conversation there in itself. But one of the attractive points of unlisted assets is typically a long-term yield. So let's say you go out and buy an office building. Now, pre-COVID, I mean, no one could have predicted COVID, but let's talk in pre-COVID world. You had potentially a really long yield that was going to pay you X amount of percentage per year, 6, 7, 8% a year.
Yeah, like an office building in Sydney.
Yeah,
like a
right.
Tower.
Yeah. You buy a toll road, you buy an airport, or a proportion of it. You can really factor in what those cash flows are going to look like over a long...
With a high level of confidence, which would be
with a high level of confidence.
Beneficial if you're paying out a defined benefit.
Yeah. And a lot of interestingly, a lot of the dilemma that industry funds have is the enormous amount of money that is being rolled in, contributed every single week. We're talking billions and billions of dollars that has to be invested somewhere. Now, the Australian share market's only so big.
Yep.
Okay. In fact, total super assets exceed the Australian share market now by about $1 trillion.
Is that right?
Yeah, you're looking at about, I think the Australian share market's worth 1.7 trillion. The amount in super is approaching 2.8 trillion, or it did at least pre-COVID. So you're talking about an enormous amount of money. Now, the international markets would be an obvious choice for that,
sure.
But there's a lot of, I think understanding and expertise in a lot of these spaces there's a bit to be left desired for. So direct assets provide a much more consistent yield over time, or they always traditionally have.
Mm.
And I think there's an element as well of not philanthropy, but investing in things that
support the industry
you're in. Yeah. So whether it be
Reston hospitals,
Hester and hospitals, you know, and First State Super is another example. They own a portion of the light rail. You know, a lot of their people would either help build it or operate it. It's I'm sure you know, for Uni Super there'd be investments that they would have gone into which is designed to provide jobs for membership, but also lead to a better outcome for members over time. I think that there is that element of it. Obviously, first and foremost, and it's written in the CIS Act that you need to try and achieve the best possible return that you can for the clientele, and that's obviously the overarching goal.
Yeah.
But then there's probably a couple of things that sit below that which would make those decisions.
I read an article, this was a few years ago, so don't quote me on the detail, but effectively, I think it was Canada. And Canada, I could be miles off here, but I think Canada have not a voluntary pension system, but actually a compulsory one. So it's like a compulsory super fund thing. And then in retirement, it's almost like a similar defined benefit structure. Mm. And what this article was talking about is they say, well, hang on, the Canadian, whoever owns that pension fund, they know exactly the demographic, they know the age, they know the average income, and they know like the average age of retirement and how far away that will be. So they have a level of confidence, they have a level of certainty over when the drawings will happen and at what rate. Traditional retail funds, liquidity is key because you never know. You could have 100% redemption on any day, right? But in an industry fund, or not an industry fund, but in this Canadian pension fund, which I'm sort of thinking could sort of be quite similar to the industry fund, you have a level of confidence where you actually don't need liquidity because people can't get their money back in the same way as a traditional fund. And that opens up doors to less traditional asset classes. So as an advisor, I think about a particular client or any specific client. My focus is that client in and of themselves, and liquidity is really important. However, if I'm an advisor in an industry fund and I know that the fund is doing the calculations behind the scenes on the redemption rates and they're managing the liquidity, of which we can have a high level of confidence behind that, then maybe it's okay that the unlisted asset property gets revalued in 3 years' time and considerably because the intention was never to sell it.
Well, I think part of that is typically a younger, I'll say this in two phrases. The first is, if you're talking about defined benefits, you have to provide, from an actuarial perspective, you've got to look at what your membership demographic looks like and provide an adequate amount of money to pay out all liabilities. That's the first thing. That aside, if you're talking about...
But it's never going to be 100%. That's what I'm saying.
Well, it's hard to get it to 100%.
Well, but in a defined benefit scheme, if you're the fund manager of a defined benefit, there couldn't be a situation where 100% of the members are going to withdraw 100% of the funds on a given day.
Yeah, but a lot tried to budget for that. So a lot of the bigger funds will try and budget for an event that happens, a cataclysmic event that happens where they need to pay out the entirety of the DB on one day.
Really?
Yeah, and there are some that are fully funded. There are others that aren't. But what I will say is that if you cast that aside and you look at unlisted assets and say, well, what's the advantage of them? A lot of you think of Aussie Super and Host Plus, particularly Rest is another one. They've got very young member demographics, very young. In industries that are fairly transient, there's a lot of things there that says, well, these guys aren't going to access this money for several years, if not decades. And therefore having a large unlisted asset actually makes sense because you know what the outcome is going to be over a fairly long period of time, and the valuation of that asset should always go up. The exception to that rule, of course, is when you've got a situation, as is the case at the moment, where government says, well, you can access 10 grand before July, and then you can access 10 grand after July, and particular funds who have the demographic that really has been impacted by COVID, has really taken advantage of that, and pulled out a lot of money, and that brings into question that liquidity point that you made before.
You would really like to think there was consultation between the government and industry funds of these holders of assets,
and whether it's industry or retail, I think that there probably was not a lot of consultation. My guess is that the Treasury said, well, this is a way to soften the fiscal blow.
We need to act. We need something.
What's a way to take the pressure off the fiscal response that we need to? And I think the government's fiscal response has been pretty good thus far, but how can we take the burden off the taxpayer and put it back onto something else? And one of the solutions was to access this $2.8 trillion worth of wealth that's built up in a system or a structure, or a superannuation is a tax structure at the end of the day, but the investments that are held within it. Yeah.
Well, we're on the other side of the financial year now, so I can only imagine the thick of the second batch of that 10 grand will be coming through shortly. So.
Yeah, well, I read as of yesterday, I think it was in the Fin Review, it was 325,000 people have gone again. Wow. Or either not necessarily gone again, but tried to access up to 10 grand
in the new financial year.
So it's been just as swift as the last. But I think, mate, there's no doubt that people out there are really, really struggling financially. And it is a pot of money that a lot of younger people, I mean, I'm 32, you're 31, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of younger people don't see this as being their
real money,
real asset, real money or real asset for several decades. So why not get it now? Not necessarily and spend it, but pay down debt or do something other than that.
Yeah, I've got a couple of mates who have I make this thing where I don't want to talk to my mates about financial advice. If ever they ask me for advice, I refer them to you. But I have had a couple say to me, "Yeah, Ray, I've done this. I've taken it out and used the system to my advantage." But to be fair to them, they've paid off credit cards, and it sounds like they're doing a lot of good things. But what an interesting time to be a fund manager, right?
Interesting time to be a fund manager, and I think not only are you having to balance liquidity, as you mentioned, and obviously provide enough money in cash to fund a lot of the withdrawals that are occurring
at a time when the assets are lower than
at a time when the assets are lower, and at a time when a lot of the unlisted assets, as you mentioned before, have been devalued. But I think as well, the impact on people is going to be fairly profound. I mean, you and me did the calculation the other day, and if you take out 20 grand now, when you're our age, you're looking at something in the order of $230,000 at 60 or 65. So it has a profound impact, and that's what a lot of people don't consider. But at the same time, if you're under substantial economic pressure and you've lost your job, or there's other things that have happened, well, then it is something that you'll see as an attractive option.
Definitely difficult to be too hard, I think, on people who don't take a rational view on things at a time where there's a pandemic. It's like,
and no one could have predicted this, Ray. I don't think it's
Bill Gates apparently.
Did he? Okay, well, Bill's smarter than you and me, no doubt.
Yeah.
So I can believe that one.
But with that, Jolly, Really appreciate the time this afternoon. For those listening, we're at the back end of Friday afternoon, and it's been a long old week, so I appreciate it. For those that are keen to have a chat or a chinwag with you,
Well, mate, there's many ways. It depends if you want to have a chinwag in a professional sense or a social sense. In a professional sense, LinkedIn, yeah, absolutely. Come and visit me at 64 York Street, level 12. You can find me there most days. Otherwise, Hotel CBD
across the road,
up on York Street there, or the Occidental. Many listening would know that well. So, yeah, I'd love to catch up anytime.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ray.